All right, so moving on now with Rudolf Steiner's rather unusual history of Europe through the reincarnations of its prominent figures. In this case, he only does one case study, and that is the reincarnations of the Emperor Nero, the fifth emperor of Rome, and unquestionably the most debauched and decadent of them. Rome produced quite a few: Caligula, Commodus. There are others, but Nero, I think, takes the award for the most debauched of all the emperors. And so Steiner gives us a couple of his next incarnations after being Nero the fifth emperor. He was born in Antium in 37 AD and lived to 68 AD. And now he had a very close, physically incestuous relationship with his mother, Agrippina the Younger, and they are related to the Claudian line. So Claudius is emperor at this time. And Claudius has a son, Britannicus, and a daughter, Octavia, whom Nero marries. He marries the daughter, but there's that troublesome issue of the son. Agrippina really wants to rule the Roman Empire by proxy, so she really wants to get Nero in there. So what she does is, I think Claudius is about 64 years old at this point. She marries him in one account. There are varying accounts, but she poisons him and gets rid of him. So now there's only Britannicus to worry about. But for now, there's this warm, cozy, incestuous relationship between Nero and his mother, Agrippina the Younger. And Nero didn't really want to be an emperor. He wanted to be some sort of an artist. He was a dilettante, basically. He liked to act. He liked to play the lyre. He liked to perform. He liked to play the roles of both men and women, which some have regarded him as a cross-dresser for that reason in the theater. None of this was becoming to a Roman emperor. Roman emperors did not fuck around with the arts in that way. They might have been patrons of the arts, as Augustus was, but they didn't actually perform and have pretensions of being an artist, which is what Nero really liked and wanted to do. But his incestuous relationship with Agrippina was getting sort of more and more uncomfortable for him, so he decided to have her murdered, and he built a boat that would fall apart. It was specifically designed to fall apart, sent her on a voyage to the region of Naples. The boat did indeed fall apart, but she survived. She swam ashore and survived. And Nero was terrified of her and what she might do, and so he sent assassins to kill her. So he murdered his mother. And his mother really was looking at Britannicus, Nero's half-brother, as a possible replacement for Nero, because she and Nero had been growing very distant with each other. So he had Britannicus murdered, of course, as well. So he's murdering off his family. Here's a coin which shows, interestingly, Agrippina here and then Nero here, as though they were co-rulers, as though she were a co-regent on the throne. And her name is on here, but his name is on the back. So it's very interesting. That says a lot about Agrippina and her pretensions to power. She really wanted power. She really wanted to rule by proxy. And then he's married to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius. He doesn't like her. Really has no interest in her. He's having affairs with senators' wives, just like John Kennedy was doing. Having affairs with senators' wives, but then a particular woman named Poppaea took his interest. And Poppaea was already married to a man named Otto, who would later become an emperor briefly after Nero's death. And so the question is now, they're both married, so what does he do about it? What he does is, of course, accuse his wife Octavia of adultery and has her put to death. And then he has Otto sent to Spain, to the area of Lusitania, to govern there, and gets rid of him that way. So now he has Poppaea all to himself. And then, so Then the fire breaks out. Now, the fire is very controversial in 64 AD, which burns down 2/3 of Rome over 6 days. And the question becomes, did Nero start the fire or did someone else do it? And there are both reasons for and against this. Reasons against this are that Nero had investments in property in the city. Why would he want to burn down his own properties? So that's one issue. Another issue is that some say he wasn't even in the city when the fire was going. And the cliche that Nero fiddled while Rome burned is ridiculous. He played the lyre, not the fiddle. So we don't even know for sure whether he was in the city. The only other possibility would be, and of course he used them as scapegoats, would be Christians burning down the city. I find that highly unlikely. My gut instinct tells me that it was indeed Nero who burned it down just for fun. He was that kind of a guy. He was totally debauched. And he took advantage of areas that were then cleared of residential insuli, what were called their equivalent of skyscrapers, 4 or 5 story apartment buildings, hives that would collapse during earthquakes. Got rid of all those. Then he decided to build a Versailles-like palace, a huge palace on those grounds that had been cleared. So he definitely took advantage of the opportunity and built a huge palace with a very large lake there. And later on, after he's dead and they eventually build the Colosseum, they build it on that spot where the lake was. And it's called the Colosseum because it had a colossal statue of Nero outside of it initially. Why they would want to honor him later on, I don't know. I have no idea. So he decided to scapegoat the Christians, and that's when he started throwing them to the lions. And he had Peter crucified. Peter was traditionally crucified upside down, and he had Paul put to death, both of those. And now Seneca was a man who had been his tutor from boyhood, a little bit like Aristotle tutoring Alexander the Great, except that Alexander was great and Nero was the opposite. And so he has his own tutor put to death in a plot. Once he learns, he's away somewhere for a while, and he learns that the senators, 4 or 5 of them, along with Seneca, have engaged in a conspiracy to get rid of him. And so once he finds out about that, he has the senators put to death, including Seneca. And it was Seneca's plays, which had such a huge influence on Shakespeare. Tacitus, by the way, I forgot to mention this. We mentioned Tacitus last time, and his reincarnations eventually as Emerson. Tacitus is one of the primary sources for the biography of Nero, along with Suetonius. And I've read both of those guys, and they're amazing. Just fantastic reading. So there's a reason why Steiner picks who he picks. There's an organic logic, a flow to this. And then so while he's away at Avila now, the Senate then turns around and declares him an enemy of the state. So what the Senate does is they're going to send men to kill him, and he knows that. So he commits suicide with the help of his assistant, who helps him force a knife blade jammed into his throat. And that's how he died. Got exactly what he deserved. That sounds like a pretty horrible death. Okay, so that is the life of Nero, one of the most debauched individuals of all time. I think everyone's in agreement on that. Let's take a look at his astro chart here, because I think it sheds a little bit of light on who he was. The first thing to notice here is on his ascendant, and the ascendant has to do with your personality, the face that you show to the world. The descendant has to do with one-on-one relationships with people, and of course the midheaven has to do with career, and the lower heaven has to do with the personal unconscious. But he's got this cluster right here of Pluto conjunct Mars conjunct Sun. That's extreme aggression. As I pointed out on my video on serial killers, and this man was a kind of serial killer. They often have this. This is force and brutality going right through the sun, and it's being squared by Saturn conjunct Uranus, which is not good either, because Saturn and Uranus are unstable. They can cause irritability. They can cause accidents. And now, normally Mars and Saturn would be the builder archetype, and Nero did indeed rebuild Rome, but Saturn together with Uranus would explain the fire. It would explain the and I don't have the transits. It's too far back to have the transits. They're too difficult to dig up an ephemeris that goes back to 64 AD. But I have no doubts that if I did, I would find something interesting going over his Saturn conjunct Uranus, which because Uranus pulls structures apart, pulls them down, whereas Saturn is structure itself: form, structure, discipline, organization, also death, laws. And when it's combined with Mars, you get the builder archetype. But when it's combined with Pluto, there's so much aggressive energy toward other people here that it's really off the charts, so to speak. And so those are the aspects about Nero's personality that leap out at me and are pretty obvious. Now, Steiner says that there's a middle incarnation. He always has these middle incarnations that he never says very much about, but he says he was born a couple of centuries later as a man who was an assassin and had to carry out murders not now out of his own free will, but he had to obey the will of another man. So that's karmic balancing lesson number one. He has to learn what it's like to kill other men, not under your own free will or for your own reasons or motivations, but because another man tells you to do so. So he has to experience that karma. But then he reincarnates, according to Steiner, as Crown Prince Rudolph. Here he is at the end of the 19th century. And let's see, Rudolph's dates are 1858 to 1889. So he only lived to be the age of 31. He was just past his Saturn return at that point. And he was married to a woman that he didn't like, Stephanie, daughter of Leopold II of Belgium. This is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his Rudolf Habsburg, so he's coming from the Habsburg line, and but he has not produced an heir. He has had a daughter with Stephanie, but you can't have a daughter on the throne, according to European rules. It doesn't work, or at least according to Austro-Hungarian rules, you cannot. And so he had an affair with this girl named Mary von Wetzera. Here she is right here. Apparently she was only 15 at the time. He had been philandering, fucking one woman after the next through his 20s, cheating on Stephanie. That was no big deal. He wasn't in love with her. So he was going through the women until he met this one woman here who was connected to the Habsburgs by blood, Mary von Wetzera, and so has this affair with her for a couple of years until she's 17. And then what happens is that, and it's still kind of a mystery, in January 29th of 1889, now his father, I should point out, is Franz Joseph, and Franz Joseph, his brother, is indeed Archduke Ferdinand, the guy whose assassination in Sarajevo set off World War I. So because he had not produced an heir, at his death, the line then passed to Franz Josef's brother, Ferdinand. So in a way, his death is indirectly responsible for the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which did not survive World War I, and neither did the Ottoman Empire. They were both dismantled. So the mystery is that they go, the nobility goes, they're headed to visit one of their Hungarian estates, and they stop at a place in the woods outside Vienna called Mayerling, and they're eating dinner, and then Rudolph gets up and excuses himself and says he has to attend to some business. So he goes out to a lodge. It's a hunting lodge that's out back. And he goes out there where Mary is waiting for him. And we don't know exactly what happens. But the next day, their servant found both of them dead. Rudolph was sitting in a chair with blood dribbling out of his mouth, and she was lying stone cold dead on the bed. There were no evidence of a gunshot wound in either case, and the examiner assumed that it was strychnine, that he poisoned himself to death with strychnine, which causes bleeding from the mouth. But they couldn't figure out how Mary died. But it looks very much like a murder-suicide pact, because they both wrote letters. Before they died, they wrote farewell letters. So it was a murder-suicide pact. And now, so Steiner says that this reincarnation as Nero, Nero took an interest in the things of the world, whereas Rudolph did not. He actually proposed to another woman before he met Mary, a few years before a murder-suicide pact. And, of course, the woman turned him down. So this wasn't the first time that he had done this, so we're pretty sure that that's what happened. Still a bit of a mystery, though, because nobody is 100% certain how Mary died, von Wetzira. Let's take a look at his chart. So here is his chart. And the main thing that leaps out here is this Uranus opposite Mars, right on his ascendant-descendant axis. The ascendant, remember, has to do with the personality, and the descendant has to do with one-on-one relationships. But when you get Mars opposite Uranus, it can indicate a sudden, everything to do with Uranus happens suddenly, a sudden interruption into the body. Like an operation, for instance, might happen under Uranus and Mars. It's a sudden interruption of the body. So it's not activated yet here. We have to look at the transits to see if that does indeed apply. But as soon as I saw that, I knew that there would be a transit over that. I'll confess that his chart doesn't have very many similarities with Nero's. But then we have the lifetime in between, so we don't know for sure. He's got Saturn opposite Moon, which is not a good... Saturn and Moon are not good. They colden your emotions. They make your emotions very cold. These can be individuals who are very narcissistic and self-centered and can often be isolated. He's got his Moon conjunct his midheaven, though, which is one's soul, let's say, one's soul and emotions. And it's out there at the top in the public. So this is definitely a public individual, and but it's opposed by Saturn, which does cause an emotional blockage. But it can also be affairs with women. If you have the Moon, which is often associated with women and the feminine, conjunct the midheaven, it can be associated with... This could explain all his philandering and womanizing. All right, so let's take a look at the transits at the time of the murder-suicide. And here they are. So what we see then is indeed he had Neptune, Pluto going right over his Uranus opposite Mars. And so that would have activated the sudden interruption into the body. That would have been very sudden. With Pluto, the underworld planet, Pluto darkens everything that it gets near, and Neptune has to do with the elimination of waking consciousness. So through drug overdose, a lot of people who die of drug overdoses have Neptune transits, or like usually over the sun. But here we have Neptune and Pluto, which in a natal chart would be associated with the occult normally, but it's destabilizing this Uranus-Mars opposition, which explains the death, the death to the sudden death to the body. And he had just had his Saturn return. Here's his natal Saturn, and here it is moving right along. He was 31. The Saturn return kicks in at 28, and it starts to die down at 31. So those Saturn energies were just dying down, but it was headed for transiting over his sun, which would have caused most likely depression. So it was sort of in between Saturn and the Sun. Not a good place for it to be at that time. And then he's got, interesting because he has Uranus creeping up on his vertex. The vertex has to do with fated encounters between people. And Uranus was on its way. It would have been maybe 6 months before it crossed over the vertex. But the vertex itself is also in motion, and it had just crossed over his natal vertex. So all of that makes a great deal of sense to me. So that's Steiner's chapter. I believe it's the last one for a while on case studies. And for the rest of Volume 2 of Karmic Relationships here, he gets back into theory about karma, karmic theories. All right, so we'll end there with that chapter.